Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of November 10th, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. I have to really enunciate the University of Texas at now.
At Austin, that's right.
Given the new market entrance. Joined this week by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project, back again on campus in the Liberal Arts Development Studio.
It's great to be here. It's fun.
It is. You feel, not that we didn't get really good service via Zoom, but you just feel more coddled in person.
I like being coddled, and I get coddled here.
We know that. So during the last week, we've been a little busy rolling out the October 2021 University of Texas Tribune poll. The Tribune published a half dozen stories on the results over the last week. Urge you to look at that by a wide array of excellent Tribune reporters and writers. But we thought we'd unpack some of them today, more or less from our perspective in terms of sequencing and what people are interested in.
I really love that setup because it's like, I don't really get to speak from my own perspective enough.
Right. We just always, we're always just holed up. It's so internally.
Thanks for the opportunity.
You're welcome. So let's do that. Let's start with the issues that have been at the center of the legislative world for the last year. So we did a battery of questions we did a few batteries of questions related to the legislature. In a lot of ways, the heart of it was, this battery in which we gave people 13 issues and policy areas. And in some ways, and we can talk about this, I guess, subtle frames of the issue in a couple of areas, and we can talk about the logic of that, and ask people whether they approved or disapproved of how state leaders and the legislature had handled each of the following in the state. And to be wonky, which I guess is our prerogative here, and in our own little gig here, our own joint. We got a lot. I was really, we were both, I think, really happy with the way this turned out in the sense that we got a lot of variance. We got really good spread. There's a lot to be able to read into this, right?
Yeah, I think that's what's kind of great about something like this. On the one hand, I think when the legislative session started, we took an approach that kind of looked like this in a couple different points throughout the process. We're kind of here at the end now, and it allows us to look back and kind of see, in some ways, you say, what worked, what didn't work, what broke through, what didn't break through. And I think in the case of this battery, what's really, most interesting to me in some ways is we asked almost the exact same battery back in June. So we got to the end of the regular session. We gave them, I think, 10 of the 13 areas that we ended up assessing in October. We assessed with the exact same wording in June. So we can say, okay, they spent an extra, 3 sessions here, right? What did they get out of it? And what you find is that I think at the top level, the most sort of notable thing is that they bought a certain amount of Republican support that was not there. Now, this is not to say it was lacking. But what I would say is this: if you look at the Democratic numbers in June, you look at the Democratic numbers in October across most of these issue areas, the shared disapproving didn't really move much. It was it was pretty much the same, which means, Democrats kind of said, okay, what do you think about how the legislature handled election voting laws? Well, 73% disapproved in June. Get to October, 76% disapprove. That's kind of the story among Democrats.
Right.
Among Republicans, I think it's a little bit more interesting here, right? So we look at, Second Amendment rights, 70% approved in June, 80% approved in October. 57% approved of how the legislature and state leaders handle public safety in June, 69% in October. On elections and voting laws, 63% approval to 75% approval. On immigration and border security, perpetual big issue, 62 approval to 73 approval. And so really what they did in a lot of ways was they actually got the approval among Republicans on these key issues to the same level as disapproval among Democrats.
Right.
But it took a little bit longer.
Well, and as we think about that, there's a lot to be said for that. I was talking to a reporter this morning, and was talking about, I think I used the phrase something, it might have been a little I don't know, more or less diplomatic than this. It's something like, the perpetually unsatisfiable far right of the Republican Party. What's interesting is you're going through that list and you're talking about those numbers. I'm in my head, and if we had prepared better, I thought about it more, we'd be able to parse this out a little more. But so how much of that was June ended and Republicans felt like there was unfinished business with the assumption that there's that much cognition going on, and that much attention, and what of it was, and what of those things did they get it done, and then then they sold it, right? Or and I think it's a little bit different. I was thinking on public safety. They didn't
do much.
They didn't do all that much in
the interim.
In the regular,
right.
Well, I guess in the regular session they did some, but then they really brought some of it home on the bail reform.
Well, they
quote
did.
Unquote.
Well, remember, didn't they pass the basically the bill that would make it impossible for cities to decrease their police budgets?
Right.
So I mean, that's a pretty big one. But your point is well taken. I think it's
right.
important.
But they waited to do the bail thing, right? I mean, the bail thing didn't get finished until
if we're
third session, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we could. there's probably some ways I'm skeptical that we have the data to parse it out.
Right.
And I'll tell you, and the reason is just because we're talking about trying to figure out the difference between that 10% that we didn't observe in June that we do observe in October. But I think the point is important, and I would say I'll speculate. Can I speculate?
Please.
Okay, my speculation is that the increased attention is what did it, not the substance. Because I think that's the thing. You look and it's like they passed permitless carry during the regular session. They were at 70%, they're at 80%. That has nothing to do with what they did during the special session. I think that had to do with the fact that in a lot of ways, even if you weren't really paying a ton of attention, there was so much coverage to the fact that the legislature was still here. They were still dealing with stuff after they've already done all these other things. I mean, that was kind of the tone of the coverage. And so I think more than anything, I think it probably just increased the salience of a lot of this stuff in a session that we've been saying. It's like,
and that's the sold it part.
Right. That's what I agree with. That's the sold it part. And again, it may not have even been a direct sale so much as the fact that it was just being around and having, again, the legislature's activities continuously talked about for 10 months.
Right. Kind
of jammed this up. And the thing is, it's not because I think necessarily there was a huge number of Republicans out there who were like, oh, I'm disappointed they didn't finish the job or we didn't get to, an A+ per se. I think it's actually because they covered so much stuff. It takes time for people to hear about all of it or even to be kind of made generally aware of it. And we've been kind of dealing with this the whole session. It's like, what is a normal voter, not like us, not somebody who's reading all this stuff. What were you supposed to pick out of this session if you just kind of like glance at the evening news, a couple things here and there? But by having, again, the conversation go on for so long, I think it sort of probably ratcheted up those numbers from just sort of ambient general awareness.
And, I don't, this is where, I don't feel too deficient because it's not something I'm supposed to know necessarily.
Okay.
But it would be interesting to have, like Brian Jones or Chris Lejeune in here and ask them, like, in your subfield,
right?
What is there must be research on this. What is the lag?
Right.
Or is that construct even correct?
Yeah.
Right. That basically they pass it, then it takes a while for it to be sold to their base, to their constituencies or not. It's an interesting kind of question. I mean, I'm thinking about it just as I was raising it.
Yeah.
It would be maybe good to put a grid together and kind of say, okay, how done was this in June?
Right.
Did they do anything else?
Right.
And then some rough, and I don't know how we do this, but, some rough estimation of, and then how hard was it sold?
Right.
And I just don't, I don't know the answers to most of those questions right off the top of my head.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that, just, sort of in terms of thinking about the work of the selling, whether it's direct or just ambient awareness, negative attitudes among independents went up across that time period on a lot of these issues too. So I think that sort of speaks to the ambient awareness piece. If you think about independents as being sort of loosely kind of, usually loosely affiliated with the political system broadly. Yeah. And you think, well, they learned stuff and they decided that they liked it less.
Well, in our more derogatory moments, I've called, I won't rope you into this, although it's true.
We'll see.
We have referred to independents as kind of soft-headed.
Oh, I haven't said that.
But this is almost like a positive spin of independents being soft-headed, right? That, I was trying to explain, I was talking to another reporter about this yesterday, that since their responses are not so mediated by partisanship, if I might use a crude cognitive model.
There we go.
It comes in, something happens and they kind of go, they don't go, oh, what do Republicans and Democrats think? They just go, oh, that sounds bad, or
Yeah.
that sounds good.
Right.
And that's where you are, right? And so we should, what we
So,
need
yeah,
to flag,
so
we need to do maybe in the next couple of weeks we'll do a podcast on independence.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Well,
Because we need to write about it anyway. So
yeah, I think that's a good idea. So I mean, you spoke to this. So what's good, what's bad here then
right. I mean, I think,
on the list overall here?
and for whom, right?
And for whom? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think, taking it at first cut, and we've talked about this a lot. Of people listen to the Tribune podcast. We went through this at some point. In terms of what's good, in terms of what had the highest, level of public approval, the highest approval ratings in this grid, not in order, public safety, election and voting laws, Second Amendment rights. I think that's actually in reverse order, probably. So most popular was Second Amendment rights, followed by public safety, and then
elections and voting.
And then election and voting. Yeah. And then we have, with an asterisk, we have to put immigration and border security.
Even though it was net negative.
It was net negative, but because Republicans were so impressed.
They were impressed.
They were very impressed. That
insatiably so.
That has to be like right there kind of on the bubble, even though strictly speaking, only 3 were net positive, the 3 I mentioned.
Well, that's important.
Yeah, it is.
Right. And even those 3, Second Amendment was 46 approved, 32 disapproved, public safety 42-30, election voting 43-38. Again, immigration border security, big for Republicans, but 41-44 overall. Right. So, mixed bag there.
Right. And so, but if you think about what the content of those policies were, we were talking about public safety early, and we don't need to rehash what was done with election and voting laws. And then Second Amendment rights almost speaks for itself with open carry,
right?
Or with
permitless carry,
unlicensed carry, right? That's pretty good if you're a Republican, and those majorities were fueled by big Republican supermajorities among.
Right.
Within those groups.
Right, that's right. So 73% of Republicans approved on immigration border security, 74% of Democrats disapproved. But I mean, this speaks to, to the insatiability of this, this issue. I mean, it's funny, we asked in the survey whether, the debate spends too much, too little, or the right amount on border security. 57% of Republicans in October of this year said too little, and this is again after we've gone over the $1 billion threshold, almost to $2 billion.
Actually, it's almost 3.
Oh, now it's almost 3, right?
If you put everything together, those that late supplement that got added towards the end of I think the third session, we're close to 3 now.
So 57% say too little. That's down from 61% in August, but they said of this year. In February of this year, also 61% said too little. In February of 2019, 61% said too little. So ultimately, it's not clear to me that we'll see. I mean, this is again one of those lag questions,
right?
But whether, Republican attitudes, at least maybe after the campaign season, end up getting, let's say, maybe they'll say, well, we spent about the right amount. Maybe after we have a whole campaign season of Republicans campaigning on how much money we're spending on border security. But at least in the immediate sense, the demand is still there.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting piece of the context here before we go to the bottom 3. But, you just can't not talk about immigration and border security.
Yeah, no, it's impossible.
There's an interesting piece of the context here, though, is that because of all of the federal money, I mean, there's not been a whiff of any sense of fiscal limitations or problems.
Well, why would there be?
Right? Exactly. So, they're holding some of that federal money over for later on. I think $4 billion is still something like that.
Well, and they were saying today, they're closing down applications to the rent relief program, and there's still a bunch of money in there. I mean, it's sort of, it's what me worry.
Well, how many, what is the translation of how many months of rent by how many feet of fence?
Well, I was going to say
barrier.
Well, I'll say, you know who's not getting a tax kickback? Renters, and that's
right.
Brings us to the bottom 3.
Right. So then the bottom 3 on this list were property taxes, K through 12 education, and then dead last, and obviously my hobby horse right now, the reliability of the electric grid.
Right.
And the electric grid numbers, we'll start with that, are just, amazing. I mean, only 18% only 18% approved, only 6% approved strongly, 60% disapproved, 42% strongly.
And that's up from 52% in June.
Yeah.
So, the window in between in which, there was this whole kind of brief discussion about how, the legislators were bringing, the regulators to task for, the bills that they passed. Not looking good.
Yeah, but I mean, the politics of that obviously have been very interesting in terms of where the Republican leadership is, and this was an area where, there was a lot of daylight, natural daylight, not electrically lit daylight between the lieutenant governor and the governor on this.
Well, and this is something where it shows. I mean, we're kind of implying something, or not to be all academic again, but about the role of elites in forming a public opinion.
Right.
Now, it's all endogenous, by which I mean they affect each other. The messages and communications of a leader are affected by the views of their constituents,
right,
and vice versa. But
one of the great social science diagrams of the arrows just
go in a circle.
Goes in a circle.
But the thing,
very illuminating.
But the thing is here, whereas there's almost no daylight between Republicans on let's say immigration, on I would say election and voting. It was pretty, for the most part, once you kind of got their
right.
act together, it was certainly pretty.
They moved with
a lot of agreement.
Yes.
And I would say same thing on the Second Amendment. Once again, the lieutenant governor decided so. There hasn't been as much I would say coordinated communication, especially on the electric grid. And what you find is that when you look at that number, 18 approved, 60 disapprove, that is not, I mean, it's driven by Democrats, but Democrats didn't change. When we say that the shared disapproving went from 52 to 60, Democrats were at 75 disapproval, they're up to 78. Independents went from 52 disapproval to 61, and Republicans went from 34 disapproval to 45. And approval went from 37 down to 31. So you go from net +3 among Republicans to net -14.
Yeah.
So if there's an issue that's kind of hanging out there just
right.
like a turd.
Yes. Speaking of keeping things to ourselves, I'll just repeat it the umpteenth time. This is such a big time bomb out there. And look, it's got a long fuse that may never quite get to ignition. But if it does, I keep trying out different metaphors.
Yeah, no, it's
the bomb with a long fuse. I may run with that a couple more times.
It wants a metaphor.
It does. It needs one. But this is really out there, and I think it suggests that there's some leverage to be had from this, and some political hay to be made of it, even if there isn't another problem.
Yeah, I mean,
because there's enough anxiety out there.
Well, I mean, we've talked about this for a while. I mean, to the extent that Republicans have the keys to the car. They've controlled state government for 2 decades. They control both chambers of the legislature. I mean, so when it comes to these sorts of things, like the basic operation of government stuff, there's nowhere to point a finger.
Right.
And again, they tried.
And they've already fired everybody.
Right. So
and replaced them. We've got a completely new Public Utility Commission.
Right.
They've got new leadership at ERCOT.
Yeah. No,
shrug emoji. I mean,
yeah. Yeah.
At this point, you've got to have some vulnerability to the new appointees and to the policy framework, which you said you were going to do something about, but
yeah, I mean, we'll see.
Maybe so, maybe not.
Yeah,
right.
Voluntary weatherization.
Right. Yeah, Doug Lewin, if you're out there, maybe we'll have you on.
We should talk about property taxes for a second.
And yeah,
too.
we should before we get out. So then, property taxes, and that's another interesting thing in which. What can we assume about public opinion what can we assume and what can we surmise based on evidence, based on what we've seen? And I think, it's hard not to look at these numbers in the context of the numbers that we've collected on in the past on property taxes. And we have a good long time series on this because, we have been doing this longer than anyone else and more frequently.
Yeah.
And it's not a pretty picture. But it's a very interesting one, I think, in terms of public opinion and responsiveness.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I've got 2 data points. You can't draw a trend, but I want to guess. I want to think about it. So real quick. So overall, 20% approve of how the legislature handled property taxes. 46% disapprove. So -26 net. The only thing that makes that look acceptable is the fact of the electric grid being on this battery. But the interesting thing here again is, this goes back to this pattern. Democratic disapproval went from 45 to 48%, unchanged. Independent disapproval, 42 to 43, unchanged, -31 net for both of them. Republican disapproval went from 33 to 43, went up 10 points. So on those other issues where, approval went up 10, here disapproval went up 10. It went from net -5 to net -14. So only 29% of Republicans approve of how the legislature handled property taxes, 43% disapproved. This is like maybe the most interesting result in the whole thing. Is we went to the field after they finished the session, passed the property tax, bill or whatever.
The last minute eruption of property tax action.
Well, here's the question, right? So we noted in June that property taxes were sitting here at the bottom of the list when we asked that. I think it was the worst rated of anything in the legislature that when we measured this in June. And we're saying, oh, this is kind of sitting here. And then there was some talk about it. Kind of made sense that it would come up again. And then to the extent that they pass this bill, so you're already kind of alluded to our previous research on this. The legislature passed, a small property tax decrease a while back. And why? And when I say small, I'm not even criticizing it. It's a big state.
Yeah.
Even a small property tax, rebate of some sort of increase in the homestead exemption is exceedingly expensive. And that's the thing that we tend to find, which is, we ask people, well, would the average amount of the rebate the decrease in your property taxes make a difference in most families? Overwhelmingly, the answer is no, because it ends up being especially now in this current version, $12 to $17 a month.
Right.
Which is not going to make a big difference to most people. So one of the things that I think this result sort of raises is, is this number better than it would have been if they had done, if they hadn't done this, or is it worse because they did?
Yeah.
And that's the thing I don't know. I mean, to some degree, I'm not sure that they didn't actually just, take this issue that was already kind of sitting out there and as a sore spot for voters and actually kind of raise the fact that, well, we can't really do anything meaningful about it.
Right.
But here you go.
Yeah, it's like there's this wound out there, and instead of treating it, you just kind of scratched at it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of the feeling you get. And I think at the macro level, there's another, as we think about going into an election season and we think about, how we come to terms with the 87th legislature and what they did. The things at the bottom of that list are both, to be fair, really difficult.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, look, they were going to have they weren't going to just restructure the electric market. They weren't just, there were a lot of policy issues despite, a certain populist discourse around it. Mm-hmm. With just giving consumers a bunch of money back.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that sounds great, but, the inherent complication of the system is a problem, right? But, how much money could you have spent that of that? If you had taken, say, the extra $2 billion we added to border security, and this is an admittedly simplistic and stupid way of thinking about it.
Okay.
But I'm going to say it anyway,
go ahead.
But if you took that $2 billion and moved that pile of money over to doing something that might have at least reduced the degree to which the companies are going to now charge consumers over a long period of time, might that have been a fairly popular move? And might the $1.5 billion on border security maybe have been enough until, you just raise the bar? I don't know. Right. And, that's like a fantasy football league or something, right? Or, Marvel versus DC.
Yeah, stay in your lane, buddy.
Right. But it's an interesting question when you look at how tough it is to handle these really hard issues. I mean, you talked about, if you're the Republican Party right now, you own the policy environment. Mm-hmm. And one possible implication of just kind of the narrative that you were spinning out a minute ago is that, they're pretty good at what seems like the quote unquote easy stuff.
Yeah.
Right. But they're not as good when it comes to, the really hard stuff, and in a podcast we did with, one of our colleagues, and I Darren Shaw kind of mentioned in the Tribcast something about, the weakness of the citizen legislature, and I didn't want to jump in there, but since he's not here, I'll do it now.
Yeah, perfect.
But there is a sense in which, there's I think a more persuasive contending explanation there, which is, the stakeholder and interest group universe is much harder to handle on issues like energy and property taxes than appealing to very powerful, kind of lopsided Republican constituencies on guns and other kinds of issues that we've seen the legislature acting on.
Well, another issue at the bottom that's very simple was K through 12 public education.
Right, exactly. That's the other one we haven't touched on.
But what's interesting is this is the one that actually breaks the pattern, right? So overall, 26% approved of how they did this, 42% disapproved of their handling of K through 12. That's up from 30% disapproval in June. Now, this is driven by Democrats.
Right.
So whereas Republicans, there's a slight increase in disapproval actually over the period, but pretty slight. Among Democrats, the shared disapproval of how the legislature legislature handled this K through 12 public ed went from 46% to 63%.
Right.
So pretty big jump. Share of independents went from 31 to 46. Another big jump, again, net negative for all those groups. And among Republicans, just to round it out, it went from 42-16 approve, disapprove in June to 42-23 in October, which I think reflects the fact that all the sort of consternation around, critical race theory and transgender students, which was, again, which was present in every single special session,
right.
and then sort of this turn now to the books.
Yeah.
It's a complicated space.
Well, with the overlay of, the things that we talked about that were so front and center in our August Texas Politics Project poll, which was just the incredible amount of churn and conflict that accompanied back to school in the final phases of the Delta variant surge.
Yeah.
As we were saying last time, we were talking about it last time, and we kind of ended up in talking about public education and the kind of ideological space and, the struggle over books.
And we recorded that before the Virginia results.
Right, exactly.
It was, whatever. But
if you look at it sideways at about a 45-degree angle, we were ahead of the game.
Yeah, a little. By about
you have to turn your head
6
and
hours.
kind of squint one eye, but
right.
One could say we were in front of that. But I think separating all that out, public education has just become such a roiled space. No matter where you look, some of these longstanding issues of curriculum and again, what I think of as, control over socialization or influence over socialization, but with the overlay of all this churning.
I think to me, when I look at, and this is kind of a transition maybe to what this says for the state of, we can do a quick kind of where we are going into the elections now with all this. But to me, I look at the sort of the K through 12 public education space, and there's sort of kind of two broad observations I'd make, right? One is it's just remarkable, I think, the shift in attitudes towards, teachers and schools and just, the sense of these are generally considered pillars of communities. And, just like your congressperson, everybody hates Congress, but they love their congressman.
Right.
And same thing in Poland. You can say what you want about the public education system. People have all kinds of problems with it. Do you like the school your kid goes to? Oh, yeah. Do you like the schools in your neighborhood? Absolutely.
Do you want to pay teachers more?
Oh, yeah, 100%. Of course, everybody loves teachers, right? Although we're kind of, we're in the space right now where the sort of the antipathy towards the public education system, on the right around some of these issues is really, it's going to be interesting. But the other thing I would say, the other kind of observation, and this relates to the election season, is I think, the K through 12 public education space, I think in the 2022 cycle is kind of like what defunding the police was in 2020. I think it's an issue that Republican voters are nearly unanimous on.
Right.
It specifically targets a lot of suburban voters where the political competition is. And Democrats have two problems. One, they may agree on what the problems are. They don't have a solution or how they want to deploy that solution in public schools in a way that, clearly there's no solution that everyone's going to agree with. That's the first thing. But also you've got an interesting split here on some of these issues, not necessarily the racial stuff, but with, let's say the more social stuff around gender identity and things like that, where you have, a very progressive white electorate that's kind of, I think most active in the fundraising space and in the primaries. And then you've got a majority non-white electorate that holds less progressive views on a lot of these issues. At the moment, this is going to change, is going to move. But I don't think we're going to stop hearing about this issue.
No, I can't remember. It was either Axios or Politico Playbook this morning I think it was probably Axios talking about the way that education has emerged in a surprising way as a Republican issue, as potentially a Republican issue in the cycle along the lines that you're saying. Well, and that it's one more problem for Democrats because that's something that traditionally they've had an advantage in.
That's such a great issue ownership. So the issue ownership idea is that there are certain if the election is about certain issues, it's going to advantage one part or the other. Historically, you'd say, well, like policing and crime, like that's a Republican issue because, no Democrats are going to want to spend as much on policing and that kind of thing or be as, punitive as Republicans will, except for Bill Clinton who said, well, let's just put all the cops on the street. That works. But this is the same thing with education, right? Where education is normally a Democratic issue because ultimately no Republicans are going to spend more on education than Democrats. Well, Democrats can always spend more on education. But what if it's not about spending? Well, it's about, discussions around sensitive social issues and people's kids.
Well, and I would flag, one of the things that's going to be interesting to watch yet again is New York City with a former police officer, Democratic African-American mayor who is trying to carve out a to use your example, I mean, it's a little, I wouldn't say this necessarily other than to just reference, a kind of a Bill Clinton-esque space on policing in New York City. And, that is a very loaded issue in New York, but that Democrats have often dealt with in this more, quote unquote, centrist way, even at the height of discussions of over-policing.
Yeah, I mean,
and it's so subject to the cyclical context of crime and.
Which party do you think increased all those pensions?
Right, exactly. So that's all very interesting, and I think it is going to be interesting to watch that. And again, and I think we'll put a pin in this for next time, but that there's a discussion that we still need to have, I think, about the nationalization of politics, how that's manifest in Texas. It's another one of those kind of circle with arrows, right?
Right.
But it's playing out in very interesting ways here, and it's gonna play out elsewhere in the cycle, and it's pretty unpredictable, I think. And its broad outlines are crushingly predictable.
Right.
The specifics are not.
I mean, that's the thing. I think if we were in any other, if setting aside how active the legislature was this past session, how active the governor has been and out front, and how incredibly negatively Democratic opinion has turned against all Republicans in the state. If it weren't for that, I would say, well, this is, clear. I mean, I'd say this is going to be a good, an overwhelmingly good year for Republicans, probably in state because of what's going on in the national environment. I still think it's going to be a good year for Republicans in here just because of, a lot of reasons we can talk about a different podcast. But I think, you look at these attitude sets, and there's no limit to the number of issues that Democratic candidates can use to mobilize voters here in Texas.
Right. If there was a Democratic candidate at the top of the ticket, that'd be great.
Well, that would do something.
I heard, what I heard? I heard that Beto O'Rourke, he's gonna announce Monday.
Oh yeah.
Oh wait,
was that last Monday?
Oh no, wait. I think it was Monday before last.
I think it was both of those.
Oh wait,
Mondays.
maybe it's not. I don't know, but it's coming, I hear.
Oh, well,
he sent out an email.
I'm waiting. Yeah, I get those. There's a lot of them.
Okay, we'll end on snark. Thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks to our crew here in the excellent audio studio in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks to you for listening, and we'll be back next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.